Poplio. Today, on the first day of my action, I will talk about the so-called war in Ukraine, which, let me state clearly from the start, is not a war, but a demolition and expulsion operation, which was initiated by Russia in close cooperation and coordination with the EU and the United States to accomplish specific geopolitical objectives, which I'm about to present here. The material I'm about to present comes from an article I wrote on the 1st of March 2022, thus just 1 week after Russia supposedly invaded Ukraine, which happened on the 24th of February 2022. The article in question is entitled "Fake War, a Real Suffering: The Russian Invasion of Ukraine and Its Geopolitical Objectives," an article I wrote because I was asked by the intelligence community what this conflict means. I suspect the intelligence community tested my analytical skills. Here we go. In less than a week, the war propaganda has drowned the fading and no longer effective pandemic propaganda. This sudden shift marks the international system's transition from one phase to another of its 10-year plan to end the age of materialism and start the age of sustainability. For the past 2 years, I'm talking here 2020, 2021, remember the article was written in 2022, the world was turned into a hospital ward in which mRNA vaccines represented the primary weapon of forced obedience and mass destruction in the arsenal of governments and the UN system. For the next 2 years, that's 2022-2023, I'm referring to here, the world will be turned into a refugee camp in which war will represent a primary weapon of forced migration and mass reconstruction in the arsenal of governments and the EU system. Even a distant observer will have noticed that there is no reason for war in Ukraine, as nothing has changed in the country's situation, either with respect to its accession to the EU or to NATO for the past 6 years. Equally obvious is that during this time, the West and Russia have made tremendous efforts to give the impression of a growing rift in relations. Let me state from the onset that no such rift exists, and make the bold assertion that the relationship between the West and Russia has never been closer. And we should all rejoice on hearing this good news because it means there will be no nuclear war. Why then would Russia invade Ukraine and attract the world's ire? The short answer is that without a false armed conflict, the transition towards sustainability would have stalled, since the depopulation by vaccination strategy and the transition to renewables can no longer be forced down people's throats. Despite the global propaganda and the many layers of deception and mass formation laboriously erected to make depopulation by vaccination permanent, the truth has won, and governments have run out of idiots to boost and are about to also run out of idiots to sterilize with ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. The system's agents of misinformation, deeply embedded in civil society, have relentlessly pushed these two known sterilizing drugs on the gullible masses with shameless impunity, but they too have lost to the truth. Without further ado, let me now list and briefly explain the many objectives pursued under the front of the system's latest deception, the invasion of Ukraine, which are of two kinds: short and long-term goals. Short-term goals first. Number one, ease the EU old age burden. By making life impossible in Ukraine, millions will be forced to migrate to safe countries, and the exodus to follow will rejuvenate the EU's old population and help it lower its old age burden enough to meet its social obligation towards an increasingly and unsustainably old society. Already 500,000 Ukrainians have left, and according to the UN, millions more will follow shortly. So once again, I wrote this in March 2022. In the meantime, there are 7 million Ukrainians in the EU and 3 million in Russia. So my prediction was bang on. To make sure that Ukrainians get the message and get out of the country as fast as they can, the system sends the right signals. Russia's defense minister Shoigu has announced today, that was on the day I wrote the article, that Russia will continue the military operation until its goals are achieved. And since no one knows what the goals are, this can go on indefinitely. The American government is doing its part by falsely claiming that the Russians are using cluster bombs on the civilian population and thermobaric rockets, despite the lack of evidence that such weapons have been deployed, which is highly unlikely, as that constitutes grave breaches of war rules. The Europeans are doing their part by broadcasting that various shipments of advanced weapons are being sent to the Ukraine by just about every European country, and the Russians are threatening the EU with a harsh response. To top it all, everyone is talking about the possible use of nuclear weapons, which is enough to cause panic in the most patriotic Ukrainian hearts and make them run for the border. That's the stick meant to chase as many Ukrainians as possible out of their country and into exile. The carrot is wagged by Zelensky's appeal for emergency acceptance of Ukraine into the EU and a clear signal by the EU's President von der Leyen that Ukraine belongs to the EU, as well as a pledge by Ilya Johansson, the European Commissioner for Home Affairs, that the executive is ready to trigger an old, obscure EU directive that could provide the bloc with a fast way to manage the influx of refugees. Mothers and young children are pouring out of the Ukraine as fast as the EU can provide buses and free transport for them to every corner of the continent. Soon, the young husbands of these young women will join them, and the Western European economies that are hurting for labor will be thrown the lifeline they need to survive the last stage of the demographic transition, the one that requires them to kill as many old people as possible to keep them from pulling the national budgets down into the grave with them. For this to work, the system must prevent the return of the Ukrainian refugees. It has two options: either cause a few leaks at the country's 4 nuclear power plants, which is why they took Chernobyl first, and the Western media immediately said they noticed a spike in radioactivity, which is of course utter nonsense, or destroy enough infrastructure to make a return home meaningless. In the meantime, 3 years later, both options have been utilized. Number 2, hasten the transition to renewables. By placing Europe's energy lifeline, the Russian gas pipelines, in the line of fire, the G20 governments will be able to justify the exorbitant increases in energy. The Russians have already been blamed for refusing to supply enough gas to Europe, and this was given as the pretext for a global domino effect increase in the price of gas, electricity, and fuel. By keeping the false conflict going, the price of fossil fuels will be raised artificially high to force companies and consumers alike to invest their last dime in renewables, thus speeding up the transition to renewable energy sources. And if insufficient capital flows towards renewables, the Brotherhood pipeline that carries Russian gas to Western Europe through the Ukraine will be shut down with a bomb or two. Now, 3 years later, we know that this is exactly what they've done. They shut down Nord Stream 2 and another one, I forget the name now, the two that were pumping gas to Europe. In the meantime, the opposite is happening, for despite the so-called war in Ukraine, the volume of gas sent to Europe via Ukraine has been increased by 38% and then again by 24% over the month of February. Something that no Western media is reporting because it contradicts the war narrative. Furthermore, this pipeline, which flows across Ukraine, seems to be the only infrastructure object left untouched by Russian bombs, as though the hand of God itself protects it. Number 3, drive up inflation and lower per capita consumption. By further destabilizing the supply chain and creating even more economic uncertainty and anxiety, companies and individuals alike will have to tighten their belts and watch where and how they spend their money. The result will be renewed focus on the essentials of life and greatly diminished appetite for luxuries. This is already showing up in lower consumer spending and will become even more acute over the coming months. The higher grain prices that will undoubtedly follow, a crippling of the Ukrainian agriculture, the 5th largest exporter of wheat in the world, and Russia's exclusion from the world markets, which is the largest exporter of grains, 23% of the global exports, and the leading exporter of gas in the world will trigger hyperinflation. And that is exactly what happened. And nothing is as effective as hyperinflation in lowering consumption. Everything will double in price as a result of war in Ukraine, fake or not. Now, I have these graphs here to show what the data represents, how the data confirms my prediction. So here we have the renewable energy generation, which spiked up during the pandemic and during the last 2 years of so-called war in Ukraine. We see the highest ascent in the generation of solar, wind, and other renewables. At the same time, the annual CO2 emissions have gone down. Obviously, the more renewable energy sources you use, the less CO2 emissions you have. And we see the highest descent in CO2 emissions is shown here on the tail end of this graph, thus since 2020, since the pandemic and the fake war in Ukraine started. And at the same time, inflation has spiked up like never before. And once again, we see that this started in 2021, and it just continues to keep going because that is the intent. Governments want inflation high in order to lower consumption. Number 4, hide vaccine casualties. Putin has managed to kill 930,000 of his fellow citizens with his Sputnik vaccine and lethal drugs since the pandemic started. That's 0.67% of the Russian population. So I'm talking here 2020, 2021, and part of 2022. In the meantime, the numbers are higher. Biden killed 1.3 million Americans with his Moderna killer shot during the same time. So 2020, 2021, half of 2022. In the meantime, that number has risen to 1.8 million. So at that time it was 1.3 million. That's 0.4% of the American population. Trudeau killed more than 1 million Canadians during the same time with Pfizer's death in a syringe product. That's 2.75% of the Canadian population, 5-fold more than Biden and Putin. How many people in the other G20 nations have killed? We will know when the stats are released. I wrote this once again at the beginning of 2022. In the meantime, I published a detailed document for the G20 and the EU27, which I will present over the coming days. In addition to the highest mortality rates in modern history, our leaders have also given us the highest infertility rates in history via vaccines, ivermectin, and hydroxychloroquine. The point is that it has become impossible to hide the vaccine casualties and the fertility collapse inflicted on the global population under the veil of the pandemic. Only a world war can do that, or global disruptions intentionally amplified globally by a prolonged false war in Ukraine. Of course, the EU27 and Russia have used the influx of immigrants, of refugees from the Ukraine to hide this data. 5, collapse the financial system. By imposing painful economic sanctions on Russia, whose economy is deeply entangled with the EU and indeed the global economy, being one of the largest exporters of gas, minerals, and grains in the world, the already strained financial system will collapse and the global digital currency can be brought in to save the day. The sanctions are a declaration of financial war, and the ripple effects on the global economy, on the global financial system will be dire. The system will ensure the economic sanctions imposed on Russia will collapse the existing financial system. After all, there can be no global government without a global currency. Which is the chicken and which the egg? A global government or a global currency is irrelevant so long as the political will exists to reshape the world. Now, the sanctions didn't collapse the financial system, and now Trump has unleashed the tariffs, which is the second round in this attempt to collapse the financial system. 6, solve world hunger by killing the poor. The UN has been struggling for decades to eradicate world hunger and has failed because it faces a growing population, which is an invincible enemy. The system has therefore decided to stop trying to accomplish the impossible and to employ the final solution: cut out all food aid to the least developed nations afflicted by chronic hunger. Once neither Russia nor Ukraine can export any grains, the UN system will have the excuse it needs to stop all food aid and let the starving starve. Once the poorest half a billion are gone, the system will have no difficulty lifting the rest out of poverty. The World Food Programme has sounded the alarm that millions will starve. And they will starve because no one will have any excess food supplies to send them. In the meantime, President Trump has cut off all financial aid as well, and this will exacerbate the dire famine in the poorest countries. Now on to long-term goals. Number one, sustained deep decarbonization. The IEA's data shows that in 2020, the world accomplished by far the greatest drop in CO2 emissions in history, a whopping minus 2.6 billion metric tons of CO2. Moreover, the Global Energy Review CO2 emissions in 2020 shows that the world accomplished exactly the CO2 reductions the UN's emissions gap report 2019 had calculated to be necessary to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, namely 7%. What's the chances of that? The same reductions are needed annually until 2030 to prevent global warming, according to the false environmental science pushed by the international system to hide their true objective, which is deconsumption, not decarbonization, as I showed in my last article. And of course, the transition to renewables. Unfortunately, for the system, the restrictions on our mobility and consumption imposed on us during 2020 and to a lesser extent 2021 that have resulted in such drastic emissions reductions cannot be maintained in 2022 and beyond under the pretext of pandemic prevention measures. Even the most gullible people no longer buy the propaganda and the false science. So the system had to come up with an alternative, and since they ran out of ideas, they brought back the oldest depopulation and deconsumption method there is: war. With war, they can decarbonize and depopulate at will. Number two, dissolve the UN system. The existing international architecture, the UN system, no longer meets the requirements of the day. It is 87 years old and as sclerotic as an 87-year-old man. A new system is needed and is on the way. But first, the old system must be dismantled. The war in Ukraine will accomplish that. Zelensky and Ukraine's ambassador to the UN have called for Russia's expulsion from the UN Security Council, which means the end of the organization. The US Congress has echoed the notion of ousting Russia from the UN's most important body. Once Russia is out and the UN can no longer fulfill its primary duty, uphold international peace, the UN will become utterly obsolete. Hopefully, a planetary well-being authority will take its place, as I have envisioned and called for since 2015. Now, since I wrote that 3 years ago, nearly 3 years ago, no, more than 3 years ago, now there are calls to kick out even the United States from the UN Security Council and from the UN body. And indeed, the United States has pulled out of the WHO and other UN bodies. So the dissolution of the UN system is proceeding as planned. Number three, shatter Russian nationalism. The world cannot survive the next 50 years without unfettered access to Russia's vast natural resources, and the system's corporations cannot access them until Russia's nationalism is dead and buried. This is Putin's role, which is why he took on the task of starting a war in Ukraine. Since the fake war started, Putin killed circa 20 of his generals and more than 300 other high-ranking military men to ensure that the army is no longer a stronghold of nationalism. That's a higher death rate of high-ranking military personnel than during the First and Second World Wars, which were real wars. Putin has always been a pillar of the international system, just as the Soviet Union has always been a pillar of the UN system and a founding member, of course. He was not allowed to stay in power for this long for no reason at all. The West knew Putin would be needed during the crucial last phase of the demographic transition and to give the last blow to the era of consumerism. Who better to do that than the son of communism and a former KGB agent, who will be able to declare that capitalism is dead? For whether we like it or not, the era of sustainability that has started will be more like communism and less like capitalism, so long as there are nearly 8 billion souls to feed. If all COVID vaccinated people die in the next 5 years, which is a possibility, the rest will lavish in newly freed wealth. If not, we will all have to tighten our belts. By isolating Russia, making life impossible for Russians outside their own country, nationalism will take its last breath in Russia in 2022. And since Russia is the last remaining stronghold of nationalism in the world, the other nations still hanging on to the ghost of the past will give up too. Then full global integration of the planet's resources and the seamless global market becomes possible. 4. Redistribute wealth. The confiscation of the wealth of Russia's oligarchs has started. It will not stop there. By the middle of this century, at the latest, the era of billionaires will come to an end. I will put an end to this as soon as there is a planetary well-being authority, if I have a say in the matter. But with or without me, the grotesque distribution of wealth we have today, which is the most skewed in history by far, will come to an end, if not peacefully, then brutally. 5. At last, denuclearize the world. By bringing the world to the brink of nuclear war, the international system seeks to activate now dormant denuclearization plans and galvanize the global population to insist on the complete elimination of nuclear weapons and a nuclear weapons-free world. This, however, cannot be accomplished until Russian and American nationalists are consigned to the past. Nuclear weapons are no longer needed. Nuclear deterrence as a front for population control has been replaced by global warming as the way in which the principle of mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon, needed for continuing to control population growth across the globe can be maintained. The nuclear demilitarization will start in Europe, and Russia's Foreign Minister Lavrov has signaled that the US must remove its nuclear weapons from Europe and refrain from installing new nuclear weapons facilities in the former Eastern Bloc countries. Now, why they haven't done this already is beyond me. I guess they're waiting for the problem in Palestine to be solved. And now they're using the Israel-Iran conflict to advance this agenda. 6, and last, create a global granary. Once 500 million people have been starved across the world by preventing Ukraine from growing and exporting any grains and preventing Russia from exporting any grains for a couple of years, and once the most fertile agricultural regions of Ukraine have been cleared of people by forcing them to migrate to the EU, Ukraine's territory will be transformed into the world's granary to feed the many regions that will be unable to feed themselves as the climate changes and arid regions become useless for agriculture. Furthermore, a way had to be found to compensate for the loss of agricultural land over the past 40 years, about a third of the arable land we used to have. The US is preparing a similar strategy for the Americas, which is why Bill Gates has become the largest owner of farmland in the US. This, in a nutshell, is the full scope of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, why was Ukraine chosen to save the EU and Russia from demographic and economic collapse? Why the Ukraine and not other nations? Well, there are many reasons why Ukraine was deemed the only suitable candidate for the task of rescuing the EU and Russia. First, because it is a Christian country and the Western European nation that was in most dire need of fresh blood. Germany could no longer handle the huge influx of Muslim immigrants and refugees without triggering a civil war. The same consideration goes for all other European nations, since they all opened their doors willingly to more than 7 million Ukrainian Christian refugees, which they would have never done for the members of any other religion. As for Russia, which already has 26 million Muslims, or 15% of its total population, to rejuvenate its Christian population west of the Caucasus with Muslim refugees would have been suicide. Second, because it is a Caucasian country and a European country whose people look like, behave, and share the same values, norms, and education as any other Europeans, and that makes the assimilation and integration of millions of Ukrainians in the EU much easier and faster. Third, because Ukraine is the only Caucasian nation outside the EU bloc large enough to contribute a significant number of immigrants to the EU and Russia. Being a nation of more than 42 million people, and therefore the 8th largest in Europe, it could afford to give 6, 7, 8, 10 million of its people to the EU and another 1 to 3 million to Russia, which is exactly what has happened. And we see that Ukraine is really the only option. Belarus would have been is the only other country left outside of the EU, but Belarus is too small, only has 9 million people. And it is too closely integrated with Russia. Furthermore, Belarus doesn't have much of a Jewish population, whereas Ukraine still does. 0.3% of Ukraine's population is still Jewish. So they had to find a treacherous Jew to expulse and to destroy the homes of millions of Ukrainian Christians. A Christian wouldn't have done that. They had to find a Jew, and Zelensky fit the bill. Now, fourth, because it has a large and fertile landmass that can feed millions of people around the world who live in countries that can no longer feed themselves and who therefore rely on imported food for their survival. Its size and fertility also allow the EU to increase the number of people it can support sustainably once Ukraine becomes part of the EU, which is indeed the plan. So as you can see, Ukraine is a large country and the most fertile in Europe. Once it is added to the EU, its ability to feed and support the population will increase. Ukraine was chosen since there was no other Caucasian and Christian nation in Europe large enough in population and in landmass that was not already part of the EU. These are the considerations that favored the EU. Fifth, also because various parts of Ukraine once belonged to neighboring countries. These include Poland, Lithuania, Russia, Romania, and Czechoslovakia, especially during periods between the 14th and 18th centuries and in the aftermath of World War I. Specifically, Western Ukraine was divided between Poland, Romania, and Czechoslovakia after World War I. As such, it was easier to justify its cannibalization, especially since many Ukrainians identify by other ethnicities. Only 77.8% of the population of Ukraine is Ukrainian, while 17.3% is Russian, 0.6% is Belarusian, 0.5% is Moldovan, 0.5% is Crimean Tatars, 0.4% Bulgarian, 0.3% Hungarian, 0.3% Romanian, 0.3% Polish, 0.2% Jewish, and 1.8% belongs to other ethnicities. But there are several considerations that would have also factored into the decision to choose Ukraine that favor Ukraine and not the EU. And these considerations are all related to Ukraine's catastrophic demography. Its median age is 44.7 years and rising rapidly. Its total fertility rate of 1.3 children per woman is dangerously close to extinction level. Its life expectancy of just 73 years is dismal even when compared with the rest of the world, and embarrassing when compared with the rest of Europe, which stands at 81.5 years. Ukraine was already in population collapse, its population decreasing since 1993, and with a negative natural change since 1991. Unable to attract immigrants, Ukraine would only continue to decrease rapidly. The leaders of the EU, US, Russia, and Ukraine itself have therefore decided that since the country is already collapsing, its people would be better off if relocated to the EU, at least a part of its population. And if enough Ukrainians are forcibly moved to the EU to leave Ukraine with an optimal population of fewer than 36 million, which is indeed what has happened, then those who remain in the motherland would benefit from a sudden rise in their standard of living, not to mention from the largesse of the EU and the US in reconstruction money, which, as we can see, keeps pouring in, money that is already pouring in under the guise of military aid. As it is, Ukraine's GDP per capita of $4,534 is far lower than the EU's, which stands at $37,433. And this gives Ukrainians who have left the country an incentive to remain in the EU, and those who are still in the country an incentive to become part of the EU. Therefore, Ukraine, and not just the EU and Russia, benefit from this staged war. Here, I would like to mention only that if Ukraine is kept at an optimal population and is run more efficiently, then it can produce far more food and become an even greater exporter of grains to the rest of the world. This is particularly important so long as the global population increases and more countries find themselves reliant on imports for their food security. One would do well to remember that despite the idiotic statements of Elon Musk and others like him, the global population is not decreasing but still growing rapidly, and circa 83 million people are added to the existing 8.1 billion every year. As such, the short-term pain imposed on Ukraine translates into long-term benefits for Ukraine, the EU, Russia, and the world at large. This is a hard pill to swallow, and one could only hope that this strategy will not be used again by the international system and that a population stabilization law will instead be legislated and implemented worldwide. There are signs, however, which indicate that the international system is getting ready to use staged wars throughout the world. Needless to say, I consider this foolhardy beyond belief because we do have a far superior alternative, a population stabilization law that is elegant, free of cost, and relatively painless, and that will set in motion a cascade of positive effects that will transport our civilization to a much higher level of being. But this is tomorrow's subject. Thank you for your attention.